10 design choices that have worked for decades and will keep working for decades more. Here they are. Curtains hung as close to the ceiling as possible, regardless of where the window itself actually sits, has been correct for as long as rooms have had windows worth dressing. The principle has nothing to do with any particular design movement's preference and everything to do with a simple, unchanging fact about perception. The eye reads the height of a wall by the highest point it can find fabric or molding to measure against, and a curtain hung at the window frame gives it that measurement at the window's actual, often modest, height. A curtain that runs from ceiling to floor instead removes that measurement entirely. The eye follows the fabric upward, finds no clear stopping point until it reaches the ceiling, and reads the entire wall as taller than it would have otherwise. This is not an illusion in the deceptive sense. It is simply a more generous and more accurate use of the vertical space the room actually contains, rather than artificially truncating it at the window's edge. Every decade of small space design rediscovers this principle independently, attaches its own name and aesthetic to it, and then moves on. But the underlying mechanism never changes, because the way human vision measures a room has not changed either. Multiple warm light sources positioned at low heights instead of one bright fixture overhead is not a recent discovery dressed up in new branding. Before electric light existed at all, every home was lit by candles, oil lamps, and firelight positioned around a room at human height rather than beamed down from a single point above it. And the warmth, depth, and shadow that arrangement produced has never stopped feeling more comfortable than uniform overhead brightness. The reason is physiological as much as aesthetic. A single bright source overhead flattens every surface it touches and eliminates the shadow that gives a room visual depth, while multiple low sources create pools of light with genuine darkness between them. And that contrast is what a room actually looks like when it is being lived in rather than simply illuminated for a task. Every generation of interior design rediscovers this principle as though it were new, gives it a contemporary name, and applies it with the conviction of an original insight. It was never original. It was simply correct before electricity made the alternative possible, and it remained correct once electricity made the alternative tempting. One generously proportioned sofa instead of several smaller chairs has outlasted every furniture trend that has attempted to replace it, because the underlying logic does not depend on what currently photographs well. A small room furnished with several small pieces accumulates visual noise at the same rate a large room would with several large ones. Except the small room has considerably less floor area available to absorb that noise, which means every additional piece registers more strongly as clutter. One larger, correctly scaled piece solves this by reducing the total number of objects the eye has to process while still meeting the room's actual seating or storage requirement. It anchors the space, gives the eye one clear object to rest on rather than several competing for attention, and communicates that the room was furnished by someone making a deliberate choice rather than accumulating whatever happened to fit. This rule predates modern small space design entirely, appearing in furnished interiors long before the phrase small space living existed as a category, and it shows no sign of expiring simply because the specific style of sofa currently in fashion eventually will. Solid wood, real linen, genuine wool, and natural stone do not date the way synthetic alternatives consistently do. And this is a material fact rather than a stylistic preference that happens to be currently in favor. A solid wood floor develops a deeper, more attractive grain after 20 years of use. A laminate floor wears, scratches, and looks worse with every passing year of the same use. The two materials age in literally opposite directions. This difference holds true regardless of which decade's design language happens to surround the material at any given moment. A natural material chosen during a minimalist era will still be a natural material once that era has passed and another aesthetic has taken its place, while a synthetic material chosen to match a specific trend will typically need replacing once that trend and the material's appearance have both faded together. Choosing natural materials is therefore not a design statement in the way that choosing a specific color or pattern is. It is closer to choosing a foundation that will continue supporting whatever style gets built on top of it next, long after the particular style of this particular room has changed. Hiding everyday storage behind doors that read as wall rather than as furniture is a principle small homes have relied on for centuries, long before any design movement gave it a formal name or treated it as a deliberate strategy. A household with limited space has always needed somewhere to put things that are used daily but not meant to be seen constantly. And concealing that storage behind a flush, unbroken surface has always produced a calmer room than leaving it visible. The mechanism is straightforward. Every object visible in a room is information the eye has to process, regardless of whether that object is beautiful or merely functional. A room where practical storage disappears behind doors that match the surrounding wall contains less visual information for the eye to sort through than a room where the same storage sits in the open, even if the total number of objects in the home is identical. This holds true whether the flush cabinetry in question is dressed in the paneling of a Georgian townhouse or the minimal millwork of a contemporary studio. The era changes. The specific decision to conceal rather than display practical clutter does not. A single dominant neutral tone, applied consistently throughout a small space rather than broken up by several competing colors, has outlasted every specific shade that has come and gone within that category over the decades. Grayish was fashionable and then was not. Warm white came back into favor and then receded. Each individual color fades in and out of preference roughly every decade, but the underlying principle beneath all of them, that a small room benefits from committing to one ground tone rather than fragmenting itself into several, has never gone through a corresponding cycle of decline. The reason relates directly to how a small space reads its own boundaries. A room broken into several distinct color zones gives the eye multiple separate areas to register, and each registration reinforces the room's actual, often limited, dimensions. A room committed to one consistent tone throughout removes those internal divisions, allowing the space to read as one continuous area rather than several smaller compartmented ones. The specific neutral chosen will inevitably look dated to some future decade's eye, exactly as every neutral eventually does. The decision to choose one and commit to it throughout the room, rather than fragmenting the space into competing tones, will not. A mirror positioned specifically to reflect a window, rather than hung simply for decorative balance on whichever wall has space available, has been used to expand the felt size of small rooms for as long as glass mirrors of any meaningful size have existed in domestic interiors. The specific positioning matters considerably more than the mirror itself, and that specific positioning has never stopped producing the same effect regardless of the mirror's frame, shape, or surrounding style. A mirror that reflects a blank wall doubles a blank wall. A mirror that reflects a window doubles the room's natural light, and visually extends its depth by the distance the reflection appears to travel beyond the glass. The second mirror does measurably more work than the first, even though both occupy an identical amount of physical wall space and might look, from a casual glance, equally decorative. This is a function of optics rather than taste, which is precisely why it has remained reliable across every design era that has used mirrors at all, from the most ornate gilded frames of the 18th century to the simplest leaning glass of the present day. One flooring material running uninterrupted from room to room, with no rugs, thresholds, or material transitions breaking it into visually separate zones, has consistently made small homes feel larger than their actual floor plan indicates. The eye reads a continuous, unbroken surface as one continuous space, and it reads a floor divided by rugs or changing materials as several smaller spaces stitched together, regardless of whether the actual square footage is identical in both cases. This has essentially nothing to do with current taste in flooring material, color, or finish, all of which have cycled repeatedly through fashion and back out of it. It has everything to do with a basic and unchanging fact about how vision processes boundaries. A visual break, however small, registers as the edge of one area and the beginning of another, and a small home accumulating several such breaks across its limited floor plan ends up reading as more fragmented and more cramped than the same home, with one continuous surface throughout. Whatever specific flooring material is fashionable in any given decade, the decision to run it continuously rather than breaking it into zones has remained the more spatially generous choice in every one of those decades. A cleared surface, a section of bare wall, an empty corner left alone on purpose rather than filled simply because it was available. These have always made the objects placed elsewhere in the room more visible, not less. And this is true regardless of which design philosophy happens to be fashionable at any given time. This is not a minimalist invention, despite minimalism's frequent claim to have discovered it. It is a basic fact about how the eye processes a visual field, observed and applied by designers long before minimalism existed as a named movement with its own marketing. A surface covered in objects forces the eye to divide its attention across everything present, giving none of those objects the full visual weight they would otherwise receive. A surface with one object and generous space around it gives that single object the entire visual field to itself, and the eye reads it as more considered, more valuable, and more deliberately placed purely as a function of the emptiness surrounding it. Every design era eventually rediscovers this principle, names it according to its own particular aesthetic vocabulary, and presents it as a contemporary insight. The insight is genuinely older than any of the names that have been attached to it. A shelf with its objects aligned along a consistent baseline rather than scattered at random heights. A single stem placed in a simple vase instead of a crowded, competing bouquet. A lamp positioned at exactly the height that makes it useful rather than wherever it happened to be set down. This final detail is the one that most reliably separates a genuinely considered small apartment from every other kind, and unlike the previous 9, it has almost nothing to do with any specific design rule. It has to do with whether someone took a decision all the way through to its smallest, least visible consequence, or stopped once the larger, more obvious choices had been made. The curtains can be hung correctly, the furniture scaled appropriately, and the lighting layered exactly as it should be. And a room can still feel slightly unfinished if the small, final details have been left to chance rather than decided deliberately. This has never been about following a trend, because there is no trend to follow. It has only ever been about paying attention all the way to the end, And that specific quality of attention has never once gone out of fashion, in any decade, for the simple reason that it was never a fashion to begin with. 10 choices. None of them trendy. All of them correct. They worked decades ago. They will work decades from now. Subscribe for more interior design videos. Tell us in the comments, which of these 10 is already in your apartment?